Welcome back to another episode of COVID-19 from Crisis to Creation here on Mentorit TV. Well, today I have a very special guest indeed. I'm extremely honored to welcome on the show, on the program today, Vaira Vike-Freiberga. You will know her as the sixth president of Latvia, the first female, and definitely one of those individuals that has moved the needles and helped to move the needles for this Baltic state, being there when it was included into the European Union as well as into NATO. Of course, Latvia also being a member of the United Nations. Now, there is so much, Vaira, that I could really talk about, introduce you to. I mean, you are a psychologist, have a PhD in psychology. You have been born in Latvia, then migrated to Germany, then migrated on to Morocco, and then really did most of your adult life until finishing your degree and starting your professional life in Canada as a clinical psychologist. Just to give a little bit of a wrap up, Vaira.
It's been an odyssey. I left my home in Riga when I was 6 years old, and I returned to head the Latvian Institute after taking early retirement from the university when I was 60.
It's interesting to see, because when I look at your achievement, Vaira, I don't know what is the most important thing that a personality like you can really mentor and share, because apart from having gone through this odyssey, you are really a psychological, medical professional that was then basically put once back in your own home country to Latvia into a very responsible position as the president of Latvia for 2 terms with an absolutely high approval rating. Tell me about this experience and what you see right now, also within our series COVID-19 from Crisis to Creation. What you may have taken away from that experience. Would you still be in this position?
A refugee child clearly goes through extremely traumatic experiences. It starts at the moment when your parents say, we are leaving because the Red Armies are marching on the city, and we do not wish to live under what my mother called a system of lies and oppression, and we're simply fleeing west as the front advances. And we left. We had very little time to pack. There was an opportunity to get transportation. We left 3 days before the Red Army marched in. And I was told that of the 2 dolls that I possessed, I had very few toys during the war. I had to take only one, and I had a choice between a very old and worn out cloth doll with a rubber head, and a nice plastic doll who I thought was beautiful, Anna, who had been given to me just at my last birthday. And it was heart-wrenching. So you can imagine, it's sort of encapsulates the sort of thing that adults must go through. For me as a child, of the few possessions that I had, being told that, well, yes, the teddy bear is sort of soft and worn out, and you can have your teddy bear, but of the dolls, we can only take what we carry, and you have to make a choice. Do you take Anna or Greta? And it was heartbreaking to leave Anna behind. And we had a cute little dog. I have a picture of him, and that beautiful little Spitz dog. He had to be left behind. And then I have 3 grandmothers and all sorts of aunts and uncles and cousins. And the thought of leaving it all behind was heart-wrenching. So that's the beginning, and it continues. And of course, everything else. And it's really then what it becomes step by step. And the only thing I can tell people who are in a crisis, be it a personal crisis or feeling oppressed by this worldwide epidemic and pandemic by now, is that when things get really hard, you concentrate on now, on the moment, on the present moment. If it's a very difficult moment, you cut time down into smaller chunks and say, I will live for another minute, or for another 15 minutes, or for another half hour. I will survive this. I will take the next step. I'm worn out, I'm falling down, but I will take the next step, just one more step. And somehow, many people perish, of course. You have to realize that. There's not always a happy ending. But if you are to survive, you have to do things, accept as they come, concentrate on the moment and on survival in that moment, and on keeping your sense of self and integrity, not falling into a panic, because it doesn't help. My mother used to tell me there were some people screaming when the bombs were coming down. We were sitting in a shelter. It was just the basement where people kept their potatoes for the winter. And I was sitting on this sack of potatoes, and there was another little girl there, my age, and she would be screaming, "Lieber Gott, save us! Please don't let this bomb fall on our heads." And my mother would say, "We Latvians don't scream like that. So you even if you're scared, you're not allowed to scream."
That's very interesting, because that gives also a sense of urgency, but pride, and that you have your dignity, however bad.
That's right. And I took it very seriously. I was absolutely scared. I was terrified, but I wasn't going to show it. I was going to be a proud Latvian who could take it all, you see. I suppose that helped.
Yeah. No, absolutely. What I think is very interesting, what you were mentioning, starting with the dolls, is that you had a sense of loss, but at the same time, you could take something along and still have a sense of hope that there is something else. And do you think that the current zeitgeist is exactly what you were saying, that people will have to learn to let go maybe of the old ways they were used to, focus on the now, but with that also being able to not only overcome crisis, but create what the next day will bring, the future era will bring?
Absolutely. And I can tell you that from my experience as a child during the war, and the post-war period in a completely destroyed Germany, in the refugee camps there, with other people who'd lost everything that was near and dear to them, and of course their possessions and their food was what there was terrible, and there wasn't enough of it, etc., etc. But the creativity that people manifested is simply astounding. And I'm surprised that not more books have been written about this aspect. But you see it in biographies of people have gone through this, and when I remember their life. And I was very proud of my parents, the way my mother could, out of 3 peas, she could make a supper and that sort of thing. And how my dad, we were in a camp where the snow was coming in a sort of barn, you see, with cracks in the walls. And there were 100 people there in triple level bunks. And the snow was coming, it was January, and the snow was coming in through the cracks. And he said, "People, let's look in whatever we're carrying. Is there some rag that you can sacrifice? Some piece of your clothing that you can sacrifice, even though there's so little that you took with you? Do let us plug up these cracks between the planks, so that at least the snow doesn't come in." And then he organized sort of a rota of who would, there was a tiny little iron stove in the middle of this barn, but in order to feed it, he organized a brigade that ones who would go out and look for wood, and then those who would chop it, and those who would take turns in feeding and later on I read the biography of somebody who was sleeping next to me we were not actually in bunks, but on sort of shelves with dirty straw on them. And he happened to be lying next to me, and he remembered how he felt very proud when my stepfather Edgar's told him as a boy of 11 or 12, now you are going to participate and you are going to help keep us warm and so on. And he didn't have a father; his mother was there with 4 boys all alone, and he felt very much encouraged. And I guess his sense of self was sort of gratified by doing something useful. by not being helpless. In other words, I think the worst thing is to allow helplessness to wash over you. Because, as I say, even if it's a moment where bombs are falling, you can't stop them. What you can do is say, I'm not going to scream, I'm not going to panic, I'm taking a deep breath and I'll survive until the next moment. But when it comes to changing situations, people's creativity wakes up. We have this marvelous, I think, nature has truly provided us. Just think of nature as a whole. Nature is forever filling every possible niche of survival, creating new ecosystems. And human beings, well, in many ways, we are the crown of creation because we have consciousness.
And of course, you're making here the comparison between COVID-19 and the COVID-19 crisis and this pandemic and the war, because it just unplugged basically the entire society and still does so many parts of the world from the normality. Things changed, people have to react, people have to kind of plow through, as you were saying also during the war. You had to get on, you had to make the most. That really pulls out the creativity. And then you had basically the father saying, hey, participate. You can actually change something in the current situation to make it better. Do you get a sense that this is happening right now with people, especially in our societies, be it in Europe, be it in the US, also in the UK, that they let the political authorities tell them what to do, adhere to it, and actually have the sense that they're participating in resolving the crisis?
On the whole, I would say that yes, with maybe a few notable exceptions, where heads of state and government did not always listen to specialists and scientists and their opinions before making pronouncements or taking decisions. But these are exceptions where I'm thinking of two large countries on the American continent where the president says, "Oh, this is people are making a fuss of this. It's we have flu every year, and it's just going to pass, and it's not serious." Well, in many ways, we were all taken short. The unpredictable, by definition, is new. It happens. A curious coincidence. I was at a security conference last November in Paris at the French Senate. And in giving the concluding speech about what Europe should do about its common security, it was in commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of the post-communist countries. But it was, I said in my concluding speech that we of course, we have to think of collaborative mechanisms that would make us ready for any kind of security threat. And that threat could be of the conventional military kind. And heaven knows the poor Ukrainians found out that some, including me, thought those days are over when a sovereign country gets invaded by a neighbor, but they're not over. So we have to be ready for everything. But I said we have to be ready for unexpected things that happen as a result of climate change. And it doesn't matter whether it was man-made or otherwise. If the crisis hits, we have to have mechanisms of collaborating between us, because most crises will cross borders. And I did at the time, last November, I said we have to be ready for pandemics by establishing emergency reaction processes. And this is where, the pandemic came sooner than anybody would expect.
The structure was established, yeah.
That when some countries, for instance, reacted, "Oh, we're going to close our frontiers because so far the foci of infection are elsewhere." But then an example was quoted of the Sweden sending necessary equipment to northern Italy, and for bureaucratic reasons, it wouldn't be let through France, and possibly some other countries on the way. People from the Baltic countries who happen to have been abroad on business or on holiday or whatever, who wished to return home as the lockdown started, were blocked in cars and other transport means at the border of Poland. And Poland said, we're closing our border and we're not letting you through. But these people were really not in danger of infecting anybody if they were to be allowed to simply to travel, to promise not to stop on the way, simply travel right through and get back home again. These sort of decisions, you see, are the kind that one should have in an armamentarium of emergency responses, certain basic principles. Whatever the crisis, there are certain basic steps. Governments should talk to each other. Health, you see, a pandemic is not under European Union sort of jurisdiction. But then Switzerland is right next to European Union countries, and so is Norway, and we're all neighbors, and these viruses or many other things that might hit us, they do not respect
borders. They don't respect borders.
Or anything. And we have to think of how are we going to coordinate our response.
So what would you suggest?
I would say that there should be regionally, and then at the broader level, certainly for the European Union as a union already, they should have it, but for the whole continent, that there should be certain mechanisms, say a crisis hits, compulsory for heads of state or government to get in touch with each other. These Zoom conferences that are now becoming, for me, a daily event, modern technology allows that. We do not have, the meetings do not have to be organized. You don't have to travel. Everybody can find a slot of half an hour to an hour, even if it's at midnight. If it's a crisis, I think heads of state will be ready, or heads of government will be ready to talk to each other. If you like a clearinghouse, there should be a clearinghouse of activities. In my country, we're proposing or we are doing this, that, and the other. How is it going to affect you, etc., etc. It was slow in starting, of course. It was very ad hoc. One cannot predict everything. I admit that, by definition. By nature
as well. You have to be flexible.
Certain sort of channels of communication and coordination. This is what I would like to see being one of the major outcomes of this crisis. There will be others, alas, there will be.
Yeah, I think it is really, really important what you were saying in terms of where you have to have a certain process. A process where all these countries, at least here the European as a bloc, kind of get together and have a process how to respond together in coordination, that not when, one European country member is trying to cross another European country, they will be blocked. I want to link in here also your experience as a psychologist, Vaira, because I get the feeling if there is not a process, regulation, a structure that we can hold on to consciously, our fear will take over, and we do irrational decisions. We make irrational decisions, which then are harmful for the entirety and the sense of community as such.
People on the whole have been quite docile, I might say. When we have been recently bemoaning for the last, 5 years at least, an increasing lack of confidence in our leaders. My feeling is that surely the leaders of today, from one day to another, all of a sudden became more incompetent or more dishonest or more corruptible or whatever than the ones from year before or 5 years before or 10 years before. Human nature, does not change so fast. And after all, we do have, on our continent, we are lucky to have the opportunity to elect our leaders. And it's our own fault if it then turns out that we do not trust them. It's a mutual exchange. And all of a sudden people realized you cannot, in a community that is not just your home, your street, your village, your city, your country, or even your continent, because this is cross continents. You cannot react adequately without knowing what happens elsewhere. So the news media, first of all, took a huge importance. Everybody was glued to the news, but we needed the news and information to know what is happening. And the fact that governments did take over and said, well, we have a crisis, we have come together, we have discussed what we're going to do, we have listened, and this is important, they would say, we have listened to experts in other countries as well, and the World Health Organization and international bodies that have something significant and meaningful to say, and this is what we propose. And even though the details varied from one country to another, citizens on the whole were remarkably docile, but in a positive sense, disciplined, I would say is a better word. They were disciplined. They understood that in order to protect themselves and their families, it is important to take certain measures that are meant to protect others, but it's a mutual thing. If I do the right thing, I protect me, myself, my family, and my neighbors. And they, in turn, if they follow the rules, they protect themselves, but they protect me as well. And there's a sense of mutuality and being in it together, which I have found rather touching. We are frequently, I think, reproached in our day and age of being extremely narcissistic and following ourselves. But I think the crisis showed how people have that deep fount of
community.
Well, community sense and love of humanity, a sense of brotherhood with one's fellow man. This has come through very clearly.
Well, this is wonderful that you're saying it, because there's so many conflicting anecdotes one could pull out, proving exactly that point and also proving the other. And you were mentioning a couple of leaders on the other side of the Atlantic, one slightly to the north and the other one slightly to the south. I know I'm taking a wild guess here, but let me get back to the issue of consistency in messaging, as well as, you know, being respected as and trusted as political leaders. What do you think are the main features in a crisis that actually instill in me that I have, you know, a chancellor, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, as my leader, having a German passport with an immigrant background myself, that she would instill really the trust, for example, or the distrust in me that I would follow what she says or not?
We have to distinguish two things. Popularity is one thing, and trust is another. And basically, if people have elected a certain person to a high office again and again, ipso facto, it is proof that a sufficient number of her or his fellow citizens do trust that person. And you see, our democracies are postulated on the delegation of authority. We have this ability to choose who is going to be ruling over us, if ruling is the word, it's not quite the word, governing our community, governing the state as an entity where we are all participants. And by voting and by choosing somebody, we are participating in it. And there's a feedback loop. Citizens too often forget that if they are so unhappy with somebody, by the next time they vote them out of office, and it happens all the time. And besides, there are limits, for instance, for presidents. There are many countries, many countries have limits on how many terms a president can have, etc., etc. And we must have this trust. If we live in communities, if we live in a civilized world, it's a world that is rule governed. It's rule governed in our daily intercourse. Today, when you go shopping for something in a drugstore or in a supermarket for food, it is required that you keep distance, that you wear a mask, and that you wear some gloves. This is the common discipline. Other days, we have the rules that are in the in the law books of each country, and which decide what is acceptable behavior and what is an antisocial act, what is hooliganism, what is a crime, what is a serious crime, etc., etc. We live in a rule-governed world. We hope that the international community is going to become a rule-governed world. I'm part of many organizations. For 2 terms, I led the World Leadership Alliance, the Club de Madrid, with about 110 former heads of state and government, and we are continuously, and my successor, Daniel Türk, is continuing this promotion of multilateral responsibility in a rule-governed world, because precisely what democracy achieves in a democratic state, we would like to see develop gradually, albeit, but develop worldwide.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I would like to ask you about, is democracy. You just hit it on the head. And when I look at, we live in a democratic system. We are allowed and proud to live in a democratic system where we have freedom of choice of our leaders. Fair enough, we got that. However, democracy also is a responsibility. You know, if you are in a democratic state, then you have a responsibility as a participant to, make that choice and perhaps stand by that choice or even change it. And I wonder, looking at these protests in Germany, I mean, Europe-wide, I'm just focusing on Europe right now simply because we're sitting in the middle of it, where you see these protesters protesting against the lockdown, saying this is actually cutting their democratic rights, cutting their freedom of speech, the freedom of movement, and they're protesting against it, even though the lockdowns is good for the greater good. How does that make sense?
Well, I must say that Europeans, as I would say, as a large continent-wide collectivity, seem to be rather fond of protesting. I spent many years of my life in Canada, and one had rather less of that sort of thing. And it seems to me that Canada got along just as well without so many protests. Not that they were forbidden or anything. It's simply, and of course there were demonstrations and manifestations at various times. I participated in some of them myself, but in Europe, lately, there seems to be a fashion for going out in the streets. And this is understandable in countries where you have, well, as was the case with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, when I happened to be in office, and I happened to be there when it happened also. When a visible injustice is being perpetuated at the political level, it's for the responsible citizen and in a democratically minded one, then it becomes practically a duty to go out and protest. The question is, when does it become something that would need more thought, reflection, and preparation before being done? Well, we have that privilege. We do have that privilege, and that is when people talk about the right to express themselves. Well, of course they have the right to express themselves. If they feel constrained, they are constrained, and they wish to protest. It is their fundamental right to do so, as long as they keep 2 meters distance and keep their clothes on, you see, because that otherwise they are imperiling my health, my neighbor's health, or the person next to them. But otherwise, it's their perfect right.
Yeah, but populism creeps into it. I mean, that is a part of the discussion where you see, well, there are those people that are really thinking that democracy is being, at the moment, put on the back burner. But there's a lot of...
No, I don't think so at all. I think this is a misconception, you see. I think we need debates about it. What does it mean, your democratic freedoms? Can you, I would like to drive at 250 kilometers an hour, you see. I like speed. Am I allowed to do that in Germany? I don't know. Is there a limit at all? or none
Yeah,
whatsoever.
they're starting to clamp down, even the Germans, yes.
Even the Germans, you see. But in Canada and in the States and in my country, you approach, for instance, some sort of village or town, absolutely, you must cut down on your speed because you run over, otherwise you risk running over not just cats and dogs roaming about, but children and anybody whatsoever. Again, it's a matter of your civic responsibility. We live in a world, I mean, Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher who was born in Riga, we are proud to say, but spent his life at Oxford, he makes this distinction, and it goes back to the ancient Greeks. My liberties, my freedom of action stops where yours start. And we have to, in civilized society, the whole game is how to balance yours against mine.
Yes, being empathetic.
The individual against the collectivity. It's a delicate balance. Depending on what it's about, the line will not be drawn in exactly the same place. But that dialectics between the two is constantly there. And we have to be, I think, rationally aware of it, that these are rational decisions that we have to take. We cannot let just simply our emotions dictate things, not at that level. We let emotions dictate us in our private life and in our links to nature and what have you, poetry if you like, but not when you say driving on the street or
living in a civil society. That makes you civil, actually. You know, in this dialectic that you have referred to before, Vaira, I just wonder, you know, that is very much also cultural driven. As you were saying early on, you know, Europe seems to have developed the fashion of going on the streets for whatever, whether it's with the Gilets jaunes lately in France or demonstrations across the board. And then us in Canada, that is not really that common. So again, there, you know, that balance, that empathetic balance is very much tinted by whatever culture you are living in, growing up in, and allowed to move in. So it is tough. And I wonder, just to move it on and to see, Vaira, how you think this entire pandemic is going to perhaps map out in terms of this even cultural sensitivity, or when it comes to, okay, my freedom stops where your freedom basically starts, and there is kind of this fine line.
The biggest challenge is going to be the estimation of risks as against gains. The whole process of limiting our freedom of movement has been based on an understanding, and this understanding is imperfect. It is incomplete. When we're faced with a new virus, a new pathogen, the accumulated wisdom on it is not necessarily applicable. Everything else we knew about viruses until now is useful, but if it's a new virus and has a different pattern of spreading and of infection and so on, and how the carriers can transmit it and so on, we have to learn as we're living it. And this learning process is a burden. It's a burden, and one has to take risks. The risks that the countries took when they went in for the lockdown was to limit the number of preventable deaths and weigh this against the absolutely predictable economic losses that would follow from a cessation of public activities, from a limitation of movement, and from a limitation of gathering more than X number of people in the same place. Here again, it's a balance. We must have people here, now that in our northern hemisphere it's a spring, there must be people in the countryside who go out, and if it's needed for them to be 2 or 3 together, they have to do it, or else we are all going to starve before we die of the coronavirus. Doctors have to be in the front lines, not just for those infected with a new pathogen, but oncological, infectious and very chronic diseases have not disappeared. hospitals still need to take care of other diseases as well. So that the risk, we cannot prevent, if you like, establish a completely safe world. It's impossible. There will always be risks. And any step we take to protect ourselves has a probability attached to it. We have probabilistically reduced the number of preventable deaths by taking all these measures. This is clear from all the curves, from all the statistics. It has been demonstrated. The economic curves that show the downturn in economics, of course, are the other side of that medal. And this is why most governments now are very cautiously, step by step, trying to backpedal, as it were. In other words, loosen up the restraints.
There is the debate in Germany right now, in Thuringia, where Bodo Ramelow, who is from the Linke, and he is basically the state head of Thüringen, and he's very much for this approach. Listen, we don't need to be cohesive in our lockdown or opening up all through Germany. Never mind Europe, Vaira. But, you know, we had so many parts of our land that has had no infection over the last 3 weeks. Why should we wear masks? Why should we do this and that and the other, which on a federational level perhaps would be making sense, generally speaking. So he's very much for that approach, but he gets a lot of backlash from the other lenders saying, no, not at all. It shouldn't be that way, or it is maybe too difficult to manage. Is it confusing? I mean, I'm thinking there, okay, both sides have their positives and their negatives. Where do you stand?
I agree. I think both of them are right.
Okay.
If you have a definite region where if you like, the local population is stable, not given to traveling a great deal, and this can be measured statistically, and has been mercifully spared the ravages of this pandemic so far, then yes, I think they're quite justified in saying, well, what have we done so far to prevent the disease from spreading? Let us see to what extent this can be truly said to have been responsible for the good result, or is there something that we can loosen up? We have been blessed in Latvia in having relatively few to the population of people infected, and also mercifully few fatalities. But the price has been high because we went, since March, we went into complete lockdown. And there's a partial lockdown still going on until 9th of June, and then things will be considered and so on.
Yeah.
So different countries do take different concrete steps, and why not different regions? Absolutely. I think that weighing all the pros and the contras and the conditions on the ground, the requirements on the ground, the measures taken, etc. Local authorities, I think, need to have a certain amount of latitude in what they do. But here I go back to my very earliest point, coordination with others. Because, well, this virus will not necessarily stop at the border of Thuringia. Can fly in over the border, etc., etc. We have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, and so to kind of conclude this conversation about COVID-19, what would you say are, if you can think of it, the three main things that will change for everybody? It doesn't matter in what country or what continent we're living. You know, I don't want to, I call it the post-COVID-19 era, because there might not be a post-COVID-19 full stop, but just that era after. What do you think the three main things will be changing in the long run?
I think it would be pretentious of me to try and envision the future. All of us would like to do that. So would I. But I fear not to be gifted with the gift of prophecy. And I see, as always, there are positive and negative trends taking place. Our hope, and my hope is that the sense of resilience that we have established in this crisis, and it is there, it is worldwide, the sense of solidarity with others, the need for discipline, the need for forethought and clarity in our thinking, taking into account and listening to experts, but understanding that they're not prophets either, and they do not have perfect knowledge either. Understanding that we have to weigh probabilities, not certainties, that we have to take certain risks to survive. Everything in nature, every day, is taking a risk to survive, and so do we as human beings. So I would like to see that people are, in many ways, that they become more courageous, you see, and saying, well, we have been able to react, we have been able to survive, as in any crisis and any malheur, or as is in a war, there are the fallen, there are losses, there is grieving, but there's also continuance of life, and the sense that, yes, we as a species, actually, as humankind, hopefully have enough resilience to practically, in our daily lives, to react in a humane and human manner. But many have said that as this sort of interruption of your daily routine happens, why not take advantage to indeed think about, as it were, cultivating your soul, as well as cultivating your garden or your profession. I hear many voices of people encouraging us to do that, and I would say that the ability sometimes to be away from the rat race, I am personally rather relieved not to have to do all the traveling that I have been doing for the last years. I'm quite enjoying the springtime in the country, and yes, I'm enjoying the communion with nature. I feel sort of vivified by it, and in many ways, I think about returning to the idea of spiritual practices. Let us not grieve about not being able to do it in groups, but I think spiritual practices are at everybody's disposal every day of our lives. So let's go to it.
Wonderful. Vaira Vike-Freiberga, thank you so much for joining us here on Mentored TV. The insight, the wisdom, your experience is absolutely unique. And I think you do give a lot of hope and guidance. And what I love is the confidence you can instill in a person themselves to be courageous, be resilient, look back, learn, and then, plow on with it. The crisis will be managed and there will be a good outcome. Coordination, communication being the key there. Vaira, thank you so much.
Enjoy life. Enjoy every day and every moment of your life.